In Las Vegas, one night, Dean Martin cut the song in half and looked at the front row. Then the 7 words he said created a silence that froze the room. The Sands Hotel. Copa Room. March 1966. Friday night, 10:47 p.m. The room was packed, 300 people in curved red leather booths, martini glasses catching the amber stage lights, cigarette smoke drifting through the spotlight beams like ghosts. Dean Martin stood center stage in his black tuxedo, microphone in hand, halfway through. Everybody loves somebody. The orchestra swayed behind him, 16 pieces, all in matching dark suits, following his lead the way they'd done 1,000 times before. This was supposed to be show number 2184 in Dean's residency at the Sands. Another perfect performance. Another night of controlled cool, effortless charm, and that voice that made loneliness sound like luxury. But in the front row, booth 7, sat a man Dean hadn't expected to see ever again. Vincent Moretti. 71 years old. Gray suit. Hands folded on the white tablecloth. Not drinking. Not smoking. Just sitting perfectly still, staring at Dean with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven nothing. Dean saw him during the second verse. His voice didn't waver. 17 years of Vegas residency had taught him to sing through earthquakes, but something shifted in his chest. A tightness. A memory he buried in 1952 that was now sitting 15 feet away, breathing the same air. He finished the verse. The orchestra kept playing. Dean lowered the microphone from his lips and held it against his chest. The band played 2 more bars before the conductor noticed. Then 3 more instruments dropped out. Then the rest. Silence. 300 people stopped mid-conversation. Forks paused over plates. Drinks hovered at lips. Every eye in the Copa Room turned to the stage. Dean didn't speak. He just looked at the old man in the front row. And the old man looked back. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room understood anyway. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1952. 14 years before this night. When Dean Martin wasn't Dean Martin yet, just Dino Crocetti, a kid from Steubenville, Ohio, trying to make it in show business with a comedy partner who'd eventually become more famous than him. But in 1952, Dean was still climbing. Still hustling. Still taking every gig that paid, every club that would book him, every favor that came his way. And in 1952, in New York City, he'd gotten a favor from a man named Anthony Moretti. Anthony ran the back room at the Copacabana. Not officially, he didn't own it, didn't manage it, but everyone knew if Anthony wanted you on that stage, you performed. And if Anthony wanted you gone, you disappeared. Not metaphorically. Dean had needed that stage. His career was stalling. His partnership with Jerry Lewis was on shaky ground. He had debts. He had a family to feed. He had everything to lose. Anthony Moretti had given him a month-long residency at the Copa. Prime slots. Good money. Exposure to every industry power player in New York. It saved Dean's career. It put him on the map. It made him. But Anthony's son Vincent had been there every night, watching from the same front row booth. 19 years old, studying to be a doctor, his father's pride. Vincent loved music. Loved Dean's voice. Would sit through 3 shows a night just to hear him sing. They'd become friends. Real friends. The kind where you share a drink after the show, talk about dreams and fears and all the things you can't say on stage. Vincent wanted to be a surgeon. Dean wanted to be more than a second banana. They'd sit in empty clubs at 3 a.m. and plan futures that felt impossible. "You're going to be huge, Dean," Vincent would say. "Bigger than Sinatra. And you're going to save lives, kid," Dean would respond. "Make your old man proud." On Dean's final night at the Copa, Anthony Moretti had asked him for a favor in return. Nothing illegal. Nothing violent. Just a meeting. Just an introduction to a film producer who owed Anthony money. Just 5 minutes of Dean's time to make an introduction that would Clear up a misunderstanding. Dean had said yes. He'd shaken the producer's hand, made the introduction, left the room. The producer was found dead 3 days later. Dean never knew if his introduction had been the setup. Never knew if his handshake had marked a man for death. But he knew enough. He knew Anthony Moretti's world. He knew what clearing up misunderstandings meant in that world. And he knew that Vincent, sweet, idealistic, 20-year-old Vincent who wanted to be a surgeon, had found out. Had confronted his father. Had told him he wanted nothing to do with the family business anymore. The confrontation had ended with Vincent walking away from his father forever. Medical school abandoned. Family ties severed. A son lost. Anthony Moretti died of a heart attack in 1958. Dean sent flowers to the funeral. Vincent didn't attend. And now, 8 years later, Vincent Moretti was sitting in the front row of the Copa Room at the Sands, watching Dean Martin sing the same songs he'd sung in his father's club 14 years ago. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dean stood on stage, microphone at his chest, looking at Vincent. The old man's face was expressionless. Not angry. Not sad. Just empty. The way a face looks when it's been emptied of everything except one question it's waited 14 years to ask. Dean knew the question. He could see it in Vincent's eyes from 15 feet away, through the cigarette smoke, across the years. Did you know? Did Dean know that introducing that producer to Anthony Moretti was a death sentence? Did he understand what he was participating in? Was he complicit, or just naive? The Copa Room stayed silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. 300 witnesses to something they didn't understand but could feel. The weight of history pressing down on a stage where history wasn't supposed to exist. This was Vegas. The past didn't matter here. Only the show mattered. But Dean Martin had built his entire career on control. On never letting them see you sweat. On being the coolest man in every room. And standing in front of Vincent Moretti, he made a choice that broke his own rule. He told the truth. Vincent, Dean said, his voice quiet but carrying through the silent room with perfect microphone technique. I didn't know. But I should have. 7 words, I didn't know. But I should have. The orchestra didn't move. The conductor's baton stayed frozen. Every musician stared at Dean like he'd suddenly started speaking Latin. Vincent Moretti's face didn't change. But his hands, which had been folded on the tablecloth, slowly unclenched. A small movement. A micro-in. But in that movement, 14 years of tension released. Dean took 3 steps forward, to the edge of the stage. He crouched down, something he never did in performance, something that broke the perfect posture he maintained, and looked Vincent directly in the eyes. Your father gave me my career, Dean said, still quiet, still just for Vincent but somehow for the whole room too. And I took it without asking what it cost. That producer. I introduced them. I shook his hand. And 3 days later he was dead. I've lived with that for 14 years, wondering if I was the reason. Wondering if I was so desperate to make it that I didn't care who paid the price. The room had become a church. People leaned forward in their booths, straining to hear every word. The waiters stood against the walls like statues. Even the bartender had stopped pouring. I don't know if my handshake killed that man. Dean continued. Maybe it did. Maybe I was just another prop in your father's world. But Vincent, I do know that handshake cost me a friend. You walked away from medical school. From your family. From the life you wanted. And I never had the guts to find you and say I was sorry. Vincent's eyes glistened. He didn't speak. Didn't nod. Just looked at Dean with an expression that contained 14 years of anger, grief, and something else. Something like exhaustion. I can't give you back those years, Dean said. I can't fix what my ambition broke. But I can tell you the truth, right here, right now. I didn't know. But I should have asked. I should have walked away. And I'm sorry I didn't. Backstage, Dean made a choice no one expected, because it wasn't for the cameras. Dean stood up slowly. He looked back at the orchestra. At his conductor, who stood frozen with confusion. At the packed room of tourists, and high rollers and Vegas regulars who'd come for entertainment, and gotten confession instead. "Gentlemen," Dean said to the band, "take 5. We're going to need a minute." The musicians glanced at each other. In 17 years, Dean had never stopped a show mid-set. Never broken character. Never let the audience see anything except the performance. But they stood up. They put down their instruments. They walked off stage. Dean turned back to Vincent. "You want to get a drink? There's a quiet bar upstairs. No cameras. No audience. Just us." Vincent stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Dean stepped off the stage, something he was never supposed to do during a performance, and walked to booth 7. He offered his hand to Vincent, who looked at it like it was a ghost. Then Vincent took it. They walked out of the Copa Room together. Dean Martin and the son of the man who'd made his career. The room stayed silent as they left. Nobody applauded. Nobody moved. They just watched two men walk into the past. The show resumed 40 minutes later. Dean came back on stage, straightened his bow tie, picked up the microphone, and finished. "Everybody loves somebody." Like nothing had happened. The orchestra played. The audience applauded. Vegas returned to being Vegas. But everyone who was in that room that night remembered. They told the story for decades. The night Dean Martin stopped being cool for 7 words. But what happened next was the part nobody, not even the band, was prepared to witness. Upstairs, in a small private bar the Sands kept for performers, Dean and Vincent sat across from each other at a corner table. Dean ordered 2 glasses of water. Not scotch. Not bourbon. Water. Vincent spoke first. "I spent 14 years hating you." "I know," Dean said. "Not because you killed that producer. I don't even know if you did. But because you were part of it. Part of the world my father lived in. The world I tried so hard to escape. Did you?" Vincent smiled, but it wasn't happy. "I became a janitor. At a hospital in Denver. Close enough to medicine to feel like I was supposed to be there. Far enough from surgery that I'd never have to explain why I walked away from medical school with 2 years left." Dean closed his eyes briefly. "Vincent, I watched you on TV," Vincent interrupted. "Every variety show. Every movie. I watched you become exactly what you said you'd become. And I hated you for it. Because you got out. You made it. You took my father's gift and turned it into something clean. It was never clean," Dean said quietly. "I've carried that handshake for 14 years. Every time I walk on stage, I think about the price someone paid for me to be there." They sat in silence. The bar was empty except for them. Somewhere below, the Copa Room was alive with music and laughter and the machinery of entertainment. Up here, 2 men sat with the past between them like a third person at the table. "Your father loved you," Dean finally said. "The last time I saw him, before he died, he asked if I'd seen you. I said no. He said, 'Good. Keep it that way. He's better off without me.'" Vincent's jaw tightened. "He knew what he was," Dean continued. "And he knew what he'd cost you. The heart attack that killed him? I think it was grief. I think he died from losing you." "Good," Vincent said. But his voice broke on the word. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just sat there, 2 men in their 60s, holding grief like a glass of water, carefully, because if they dropped it, it would shatter. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dean and Vincent met 3 more times before Vincent died in 1974. Not as friends, that bridge had burned too thoroughly, but as 2 people who understood what it meant to carry the cost of ambition. Vincent never went back to medical school. Dean never stopped performing. But after that night at the Sands, people who knew Dean well said something had changed. He was still cool. Still controlled. But there was something softer underneath. Something that looked like forgiveness. Of himself, maybe. Of the choices that couldn't be unmade. When Vincent died in 1974, Dean sang at his funeral. Not for the cameras. Not for the audience. Just for a friend he'd lost twice. He sang, "Everybody loves somebody." The same song he'd been singing that night in the Copa Room. But this time, he finished it. In his later years, Dean kept a photograph in his dressing room. Vincent Moretti at 19, sitting in the front row of the Copacabana in 1952. The kid who'd wanted to be a surgeon. Who'd walked away from everything because of a handshake. Dean looked at that photograph before every performance. A reminder that being cool wasn't about never breaking. It was about having the courage to stop the music when it mattered. The 7 words that froze Vegas that night became legend. I didn't know. But I should have. Not because they were clever. But because they were true.